Our next speaker is Zachary Stier, and he's from UC Berkeley, and he's doing a presentation with Terrence Blackman, who's one of the co-organizers who couldn't be here. So Zach's going to do a double presentation, and he's going to be talking on fast navigation with icosahedral gates, part 1 and part 2. Go ahead.
And thank you for having me. Also, my audible, or should I use the microphone? Anyone not hear me?
It's better to use microphone.
Okay. How's this?
That's good.
Awesome. Great. Okay, I'm Zach, and I'm going to be talking about this paper that I wrote with Terrence on navigation with icosahedral gates. And we're really excited to share this. We think it's a great qualification of quaternions to quantum computers, which is maybe a little unexpected. And what I really like to highlight today is that once we have in hand these quaternionic objects, these golden gates and these super golden gates, you can really push the limits of sort of where these algorithms, how fast these algorithms can run, how fast these factorizations can be. So we're one cool thing is that we ended up shaving like a little bit off of free factors, which is not quite how things typically work in algorithms, where usually we're looking at entire complexity classes, but here we're looking at sort of the front term and then shaving off things with the low. So we'll see what happens with that in a second. All right, doesn't let me change the slides. So yes, I'm going to give some background on computing and quantum computing. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of universal gate sets, introduce golden gates and super golden gates, the golden gates that we work with here, the super golden gates, and then finally delve into the actual algorithm itself. So the inspiration from this very finite, very discrete case on graphs, and then how I actually go about this factorization algorithm, and some strange and interesting unfair number theory that comes up sort of under the hood. That I won't go into full detail, but I think there's something kind of neat that happens there as well. And then we also have code, so there's some nice examples that really highlight how fast this algorithm seems to run. So just sort of the basics of the computation are that we've got bits in a computer, it's either 0 or 1, and the only interesting thing to do is change it to be the one that it's not, or to keep it the same. And that's really all you can do with a single bit. But if we've got a bunch of bits, we can command or, so logical and illogical or. And we can do this on multiple bits at more than just 2, as many as we like. What we find is that any of these Boolean functions is universal with respect to these 3 gates. So any such function we can build without a string of these 3. And this is the idea that we're going to extend on quantum computers. So when we think about sort of a function built out of these universal gate set, we care about how many gate strings we use. We want to track how many ands we need to use and compute how few ands can get away with using now the complexity of the circuit. Now for a quantum computer, the bits are a little more arcane. So we have these elements living in C². We're not allowed to have 0, so norm has to be norm 1. And we write it in these cat notations. And we can kind of think about, though it won't be crucial, but we can think about us living on this sphere, where we've got these linear combinations that are normalized, so it's a sphere, hence norm 1, and we kind of think of this phi parameter as telling us something about the relative phase, and the psi parameter, the theta parameter, telling us the amount of 0 versus the amount of 1. So if this theta gets bigger, we're closer to the 1 end. If it's smaller, we're closer to 0, and then phi tells us sort of this twist relative to each other. So just some examples, we sort of got the perfectly balanced qubit, which is 0 and 1, normalized, and then we can also do something stranger, like put an I over 3 and 2 over 3. But we could put anything as long as the sum of these complex absolute values is 1. So it's capture superposition, which is this idea of, well, don't have to be entirely 0, entirely 1 like the classical bits would be some combination in some abstract sense. And if we want to have many qubits, we don't take a tensor power. And again, we're not interested in the overall scalar phase. So everything's kind of projectivized. And as such, we care about projective unitary maps. So we need to have maps, our gates, our circuits, need to take us from qubits to other qubits. But this kind of imposes that they can't turn something to zero, not a qubit anymore. And it needs to maintain this norm 1 criteria. But we can change up this overall scalar, the scalar still being something on the unit circles. So this is why we look at projective unitaries, although computationally and sort of working with our hands, the projective case isn't as so often lift back up to discussion material as unitary. It comes with this metric, this binary metric, which I don't think I'll break down anymore because it's not crucial for sort of things happening to know what it is, but there is some binary metric. So binary in the sense of if you got it's a metric on PU2, if you got 2 gates, you can multiply them both in front by some other gate, and that will change the distance, which makes sense. This should be a highest symmetric group, and so if we translate both at once simultaneously, we shouldn't change the distance at all. And so universal gate set here, as before, is just, we want to sort of be able to build everything, but this is an infinite set. We can't really hope to do that with something manageable, something we get our hands on. And so this is why we just care about being dense topologically. So you can get arbitrary precision from the set. Here, I guess I use angle brackets to mean the group generated by S. But we're starting with some finite set S and building out this countable subgroup, which we demand to be. And so we're actually going to focus just on n equals 1. Even this is very rich and has been the setting of a lot of very interesting developments over the last decade or so. Even before then, before we were really necessarily thinking about things as number theoretically or ternarionically as we are today, there were some results of this. So the solid-type theorem, which was proven finally by them in the mid-late 90s, says that if you've got a universal gate set, then you can find a word, or just being some approximation using elements of S for an epsilon approximation efficiently. So in polylog 1 over epsilon. And notice that we've got this factor log to the C. So I don't remember what the exact C was, it was something like 3.7. So that's pretty good, all things considered. But today we can actually work with C equals 1. So today we've sort of shaved log to the C all the way down to log to the 1. This isn't a work program. This has been known for at least 7 years. I don't know exactly when this was established. But we can cut it all the way down to log to the 1, and now we're working on that prefactor. And so we're interested in finding these epsilon approximations to given targets in this polylog of log to the 1 with some constant from. So how to visualize this? Well, if we think about building these words at a certain depth, for some notion of depth, and often it'll be either just the length of the word or the length of an identified element in the word, how many times that identified element appears. We've got this sort of think of it as a sphere, although the unitary group really is a 3-dimensional object, and sort of serves as a sphere is 2-dimensional, but you think of it as the image of the group acting on, say, the qubit 1 or qubit 0. And so we kind of fill it up reasonably well. Notice how there aren't too many big gaps. There's kind of this big one up here, maybe a big one down here. But as we keep going, we sort of fill it out more and more. And notice how it's still pretty evenly spread. So we've got a gap here, a gap here. But overall, it's pretty good. We hope to have this be spread out as often as possible. So the structure specifically, as I mentioned, we might track this specific element. Here we're going to track this involution tau. So we're going to have this finite C and then this extra element tau, and they're going to sort of intertau with each other. So once we have C, we throw in tau, this generates this dense subgroup, sort of magically. And we can think of this as, when we're tracking our tau counts, we start from the origin, start from the identity, and we're going to create a graph where we sort of pick a direction using this C element, and we go on the direction tau goes over there. And then from here, we kind of walk backwards by sort of using the identity and then using tau being involution. So tau sends backwards. Or we can go out, 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 And so we end up with size of C minus 1 children at each level of this tree. And this tau count is interesting, sort of practically speaking, because in real life there are some gates that are easier to build than others, and some gates are much harder to build. And so the sort of, maybe the selling point as far as engineering applications is concerned, is that if you can find really good gate sets, then you can find really short factorizations. So if you want to build a certain quantum gate that you don't happen to have built already, you can build it out of these approximations, a really good approximation, and a really fast, a really short, fast approximation. So you can compute it, you can build it, both very quickly. The cost being, well, you aren't going to fabricate this exact gate, you're going to fabricate some close approximation. And so that's sort of the problem that we are, the real life problem that we're not using. So just a brief bit about how the queries actually come into play in these constructions. We work with these p-arithmetic groups for these prime ideals in the string of integers. And we've got a totally definite print algebra over this number field. I said totally, yeah, it's a solar number field. And there's going to act transitively on this infinite regular tree. So the tree specifically is a trade describability, where from this set C, we're going to pick a direction, move by tau, direction, move by tau. And because we have this group building the tree, it actually acts on itself essentially. And so that's the tree that we think of. And if it's further edge transit, then we call supergolem trees. And these are supergolem is a term of this paper by Chesky and Cernak from a few years ago, and golem is a term from Cernak from. So one set, which happens to be super, but also difficult, and is sort of the or gate set, because it is the most common methodology. It's the one that's most natural to think about for people, especially when we actually work with quantum algorithms, is the equipment. So we've got AT, so notice that's just rotation on that top of the tree, and then anti-rotation by pi rate, rotation in the opposite direction. So this is a very natural one to think about, having an inclusion. And if we throw in also some element H, which is non-evolution, but it happens quite nicely with it, we have that the two of them, H and T squared, generate this group C24. And so the C24 and capital T playing the role of tau, we end up with the Clifford T. So C24 is Clifford. And it's just very natural for the Hadamard gate has its own sort of very, very natural application in quantum computing. So maybe I should add this disclaimer now that I mentioned quantum algorithms sort of explicitly that the quantum computing I'm presenting here is a little biased and pared down in the sense of it's all skewed towards things that are liquid state. So there's lots of things in quantum computing that I haven't touched on at all, such as any algorithm. I'm not going to use some algorithm. We're not going to discuss an algorithm, but there's lots of wonderful things we do in short factor and for research. Lots of scientific computation in the last few years. And this is all sort of, once you've built a quantum computer and hopefully used the gate sets that we described here, or some other similarly efficient gate set, then you can start thinking about the algorithms. This is even before algorithms would come into play. Now, supergolem gates, there's not that many of them, there's a finite number, but you can actually get one from each of the platonic solids, which is kind of, I've only listed 3 here, but that's because they come in these dual pairs. The tetrahedron is dual to itself, the octahedron to the cube, and the icosahedron to the decahedron. So their symmetries in the dual pairs are the same, and so we only think about 3 of them for these ones that rise from platonic solids. And so from the octahedron group, you can pick the right subgroup of the unit group to come up with the Clifford group and get Clifford and T. But you don't have to, you can also work with the icosahedral gates as we move. And so the question is maybe why should we pick the icosahedral gates? Well, we've got this 59 showing up, and we'll see in a second where this 59 is kind of coming from. So it's 59 children, so 60 regular. So 59 is a pretty big number. Compare this in particular with the coefficient, or the base we get for Clifford T, which is 2. So if you think of at each level, each time we add a new tau into our sort of words that we already built, we get 59 new children in the icosahedral case, only two two factors in the Clipper case. So we're sort of covering this sphere much more efficiently, or covering this manifold much more efficiently when we're using icosahedral gates as opposed to Clipper T, and in fact, this 59 is maximum. And so if we contrast it with sort of the standard Clipper T versus this proposed icosahedral gate, we end up with a 5.88-fold improvement in terms of how long our factorizations are. So we'll see, I haven't written out the theorem yet, but we'll have a long base 59 compared to the long base 2. If we do the change of base formula, we'll see that the asymptotic improvement is a factor of this log 2 of 59. So it truly is a 6-fold improvement in the length. And we'll see this even realized with our factorizations that we explicitly do for here. So these examples, we can kind of witness how much shorter they are, which is, I think, very interesting. So now we can actually talk about, I guess actually before I get into working with explicitly icosahedral gates, any questions? Anything to clarify? Also important to sound. See my questions, add into the icosahedral gates. So we're going to work with these three gates, rho, sigma, and tau. Tau, of course, going to play the role of involution tau as before. And because everything's projective, it may not look it, but this quaternion corresponding to tau is in fact, it is an involution. So if you square it, you end up with sort of just something with one component, no I here A component. And so this quotients out because it's just a scale. And so I'm saying the matrix corresponding to this is a little opaque. But what I mean is that we can identify each of these quaternions with an element of SU2. So this is the association of, you just kind of write out the four components, 2 in the first entry of the top line, 2 in the second entry of the top line. So A plus BI plus CJ plus DK becomes in SU2C, A plus BI, and then C plus DI. And then we arrange the bottom row to make it actually be of determinate value. And time is time to transfer those gates up. So that's how we translate between matrices and quaternions. But it's a little nicer to maybe see these as quaternions that then give rise to these matrices with the equivalent action. And we're going to let the theorem be our super-going gates. And we're going to find that if we take away tau and just let the other two-generator group ends up being A5, the alternating group of white elements. And this, first of all, gives us an icosahedral because it is the set of, or the group of isometries of the icosahedron. Which is sort of that nice picture of if you've got an icosahedron in free space and look at its diagonals and look at its spaces and vertices, sort of how they can have each other, ends up generating A5. And A5 has 60 elements, which is where we get the 59 from. We have 59 children at years old, or one way going back up, corresponding to the elements of A5. And the group gamma that S generates does end up being dense in P2. This is, that's a pretty good result, and that's also found in the resolution paper. So if we look at this strange-looking element, I call it eta, that's 7 plus 5 times 1 ratio. It happens to be the norm of tau, whereas rho and sigma each have integer. And we can exploit this for factorization. In particular, if we lift up and just look for integer scalars that come out while multiplying, we can identify rho and sigmas, and if we look for etas that pop out, we can identify tau. So what happens is, this is going to allow us to do factorization within the group gamma, which would then allow us to factorize once we've found close approximations. If we've got this element gamma, low gamma, living in big gamma, and we've got A naught in A5, tau, a different A5 element, and they alternate, we can multiply on the right by a candidate, once we've got this a candidate for what AM's inverse would be. And then we look for, well, the inverse still lives in this quaternion algebra, or this quaternion HZ of phi. So we're constrained to still integer entries, which means we we won't quite multiply by its inverse to get 1. It'll just be a scalar. We can check, well, what is that scale? Because we assume gamma starts out as reduced, so projective has no copy of any scalars in it. But we're going to put some scale, either 4 or 8. And so we just kind of keep trying. There's only 60 of them. You can write all of them down. You can pre-compute all this. And we just multiply by candidates for AM's inverse on the right until we get a 4 that pops out. And if we don't find any, well, then we know if we multiply by count, we'll end up pulling out 8. That would check for that. And you just kind of do this until you end up with the trivial element, the empty element, or the empty word corresponding to the thing. And this will tell us exactly what our factorization is. And so we see that we actually don't even need that much time to process. It's just linear in the true factorization of this element. So notice that I just described factorization, but only for the group gamma. So only for this dense subgroup, where we now want to find very good approximations to gamma, because once we say, okay, here's the element we're given, here's the element gamma that we'll just compute, which is very close, we can now factorize that using exactly this. That's sort of the idea. But sort of the other idea that goes into it is we can't just pull out thin air this close approximation. So we're going to need to work a little bit to make this a specific idea actually work. The motivation comes from the Alpers Romanation graphs. I don't need to describe exactly what they are. They're just these very beautiful, very important graphs which have optimal spectral properties. And it's not even spectral properties in play. It's more the combinatorial properties here, where we can, they're Cayley graphs, so they don't come with their own generators. And when we've got an element, you hand me an element of x cubed, and I say, well, I can find using this algorithm that developed until the t a way to write out the exact factorization in this group because it is a finite group. It is a finite graph. And that many generators. And so one thing I want to highlight is that we have a log p. P plus 1 is the degree of this graph. So everyone in x and q is adjacent to p plus 1 neighbors. And there's about q cubed elements. It's either q cubed or q cubed over 2. And so we kind of get rid of that over 2. It goes last time to the little 1 feeds it. And we think of q cubed as the volume of this graph, or the volume of sort of balls in this graph, which is going to play a role of, sort of parallel role of what we end up doing in the unitary groups. So this is sort of the inspiration both in terms of the actual end result and also the idea itself. Where the idea is, well, we're given G, and we'll find 3 special elements. We'll find gamma 1, gamma 2 diagonal to put on either side of this very special element gamma, which is going to have very short factorization. And that's going to be our idea that G is going to be, in this case, exactly equal to gamma 1 to gamma 2, but in the unitary case, it'll just be approximately equal, but we'll have enough tolerance that we can sort of accept the triangle quality loss that adds. So our main theorem is pretty much the same, right? Notice that we still got 7/3 and over 1 and a log base something, where something is 1 less than the degree of the graph. And then 1 over epsilon cubed. Recall I said that PU2 is, in a sense, a 3-dimensional object. It's a 3-dimensional real manifold. And if we look at epsilon precision, well, we're looking at epsilon balls now in this 3-dimensional manifold. So volume is going to be approximately epsilon cubed. Up to, of course, some constant depending on the dimension of that space. But we let the O1 eat that extra term. So this tells us that, again, we have 7/3 log base 1 less than regularity and 1 over a volume. And so this is really how the parallel comes into play. So before we go further, I'm just going to introduce some shorthand. So each element of SU2, which is just the 2 lift of PU2, has sort of the top row, the bottom row is determined by n, just takes that form. It's not especially. And then we've got this prescribed form for diagonals, where still have to be, we're in SU2, so we have to have determined one. We're just going to call those, this top one is U alpha beta, so we're just going to look at the top row, and then U theta is going to tell us what is the phase of this diagonal. And yeah, so we're just going to think about PU2, SU2 as kind of being interchangeable in the sense of if I write down an element of SU2, it can function as either an element of PU2 or an element of SU2. And hopefully there won't be any confusion as I do some. Yeah, there is. Now, this is a beast of a one, so I'm sorry about that. It's a real eyeful. But I really want to highlight is that this lets us do that same idea of sticking two diagonals on either side of some element in the middle. Where what we're saying is you've got these two elements, gamma 1, gamma 2, and we say it's alpha 1, beta 1, alpha 2, beta 2. And we're demanding that they have very close top left elements, right? They're both alpha 1 and top left, alpha 2 and top left. We insist that those are pretty close, and that is within epsilon. And then we're saying if one of them is far from the identity, so the identity rate is going to have 1, 0, 0, 1. So one of them has to be a little bit far, but it's an absolute constant epsilon naught. Then we can just explicitly write down two angles, two phases that characterize our diagonal elements. So delta 1 is just going to be this, whatever this is. Delta 2 is going to be whatever that is. And we're just going to stick these diagonals outside. And so I call it tuning because I think of it as you've got rotations on the left and rotations on the right, and you've got your thing in the middle. And so we've got these two knobs we can kind of twist on either side in parallel, sort of dependent on the initial conditions, but if we just twist them the right way, then they snap to being very close. In particular, this absolute constant C. C only depends on delta and epsilon naught. But these are absolute constants that we picked at the beginning. So all we've lost is this number C, which we can make not very large. We can make it pretty much as tiny as we want. And that's really what the tuning limit does. It lets us say, oh, we've got these two things, well, we can just shift one on either side, and they end up close together. So I can now describe in some detail, depending on okay, I'm doing it. So how we make diagonal elements work, how we actually factor out these diagonal elements. And what we're going to do is, well, we're starting with diagonal element delta, which is the phase of U, the phase of U theta. And we want to find some element gamma where each of these x's lies in the z bracket phi, so a plus b times phi for some many b integers. And this is coming from the Q number 5, right? The number field that gives rise to the icosahedral gates. And so all we want to do is find these x0, x1, x2, x3 that make gamma be very close to delta. They're constrained, of course, to have some determinant, but we can pick what that determinant is. So we're eventually going to let m range. But assuming we can pick some m, it is for us that gamma has to be close. We can compute exactly what the binary metric is, the metric of delta gamma. And we're going to say if we want that number to be less than epsilon, then this condition is sufficient. And this is just when I was pushing around the element. There's nothing really too crazy happening there. It's really just push around our variables until it's content. And so using these two constraints and using that, everything is very much number fields. They're Galois. And so we can just take Galois conjugates and nothing changes. We use also that they're totally real, right? So they're totally real. They embed Galois conjugates that preserve total realness. And we end up coming up with these extra inequalities. The plus minus just gives us a couple extra. So we have actually a whole bunch of inequalities. And now we just need to find integer c the exact side of this. So I said Lynch's algorithm because that's just the thing that tool that finds us integer points satisfying these constraints. So in particular, we've got this one, for instance, carved out. And we see that the scale is kind of large, so there's going to be a whole bunch of them. I also chose a number small, from 10 to -3s, not that tiny. But we see that this is sort of indicative of what's going to happen. Now we're going to have these long, thin strips, and Leinster is going to have a blast, just finding all the integer points aligned. Which would be, Leinster can basically back off because it's efficient in fixed dimension and just spits out integer points. So we solved for the C and D, which gave us the x1. Now we want x0, we can do the same thing. We just come up with more inequalities, more pushing algebra around, and outspits these, I guess now it's 1, 2, 3, 4 more inequalities. We look for those, we solve using Leinster. And now we've got x0 and x1. We need x2 and x3. But all we need to do is solve this problem. X2 squared plus x3 squared, that better be what's left, right? Because if you recall all the way back, we're constrained with this single dagger equation that the sum of their squares has to be a to the n. So we better be able to solve this algorithm. Unfortunately, we can't, although this is sort of this technical, tricky algebra theoretic point that I'm going to have there again. But we're able to do it. So this tells us the factorization length, assuming we can solve it. The thing about Leinster also is that if there is no solution, it tells us S. So we can sort of halt that process, move on to the next step. And so that's what we'll do. We'll find one eventually because some m works, some depth of the tree has covered this manifold well enough. And then all we need is for m to be large enough, and we just wait. We let the algorithm run until it finds it. For general elements, we have a similar strategy, but the algebra pans out slightly more. I don't think anything too different happens other than we're going to need to apply tuning, so we need to enforce that this alpha element, x0 plus x1i, is close enough to alpha. And that's just what this approximate quality down below captures. And so again, we're going to push alpha around and we just end up with these constraints. And we use Leinster. So the only sort of slick thing that happens here is instead of solving for x1 independently, then x0 independently, then some squares, we say we have x0 squared plus x1 squared showing up everywhere. Let that be a plus b phi. Solve for a and b using Leinster, and then use our sum square algorithm to come up with x0 and x1 separately. So we've got our a, b, we find x0, x1, and then we find x2 and x3 using the exact same thing, using that the sum of the 4 squares has to be a to the n. And now we're doing the same thing, right? We've got m, we start at 1, we just go until we stop, and because everything covers, we will find it eventually. We're promised to not waste too much time on any specific m. We'll eventually give up and go to the next one. And so with the phases, we stick those into diagonal case because the phases tell us what our diagonal elements are. We factor those, and then we found everything. We factored the middle one using the factorization beginning. We factored the side ones using the approximation for diagonals, and then take the beginning, and then we're done. So the analysis is certainly not bad because Leinster is the bottleneck. Ross and Selinger have an analysis for diagonal case. They use slightly different technology, but ultimately it comes down to the same ideas. And the factorization length is not so bad. It's 1 times log of 1 of this volume element. For the general one, we need to know when that Leinster stops, and we just kind of compute the area of the rectangle, this planar strip. And we expect Leinster at all when this area sort of reaches approximately constant. And so we say I'm approximately log 15 on 1 over epsilon. This is a little misleading because we're omitting the log term, but the log term does get eaten by O1, or it just gets totally absorbed. Log just vanishes with respect to the single log. And that we just sort of stitch it together, right? Because if you want to turn this into 1 over epsilon cubed, and you compensate by sticking a 1/3 out in front. And so we've got a 1, a 1, and a 1/3, and that gives us 7/3 when we straighten it all together. So we've got our precision, which of course is fine because the Thun lemma gives us its absolute constant. And that's our analysis, that everything kind of runs fast because our bound is unstrung, and Thun lemma promises that all our precision will be just fine. All right, so now that I've finished the algorithm, any questions about that? Anything clear? I went kind of fast, I skipped a lot of details, I recognize. But I hope at least some of the main ideas of how we use Lenstra and how a lot of it is just kind of pushing around algebra until we get any polys that look right. Yeah.
You will never need to do tuning again after I told you today. I have a closed form solution for multivariate least squares.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear it.
We will talk as soon as you're done, sir. Yes. On site. Okay.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that.
Yes. No more tuning. It's n squared time.
N squared. Okay, now I want to hear it.
Okay.
Yes. Other questions about the so this sort of black box that's come up a whole bunch of times, which is sum of squares, where we need to write some element of this number ring as sum to the other squares of this number ring. This seems a little daunting, but if you recall, and again, this requires an factorization, which, depending on who you ask, is either very unrealistic or pretty much unrealistic. But many think it's on the horizon, so I hope we're all okay with that. We can do this for Z, or we can do this for parameter 1 over 4 by just looking for solutions to this W squared plus 1 is 0 on P, and then compute GCD. GCDs are very easy because we know that ZI is equal to domain. So what can we hope for Z joint phi? Well, again, if we pass up to the equivalent thing and look at Z joint phi and also I, we might hope that that's Euclidean. But as far as we can tell, this wasn't actually known. It is kind of a lot of work, and it's computationally very complicated. But we did mention it, and we did manage to prove that Q adjoint IP is non-Euclidean, i.e. the number ring, or the ring of integers, which is the C adjoint icon phi, is a Euclidean domain. So as a consequence, we can handle most primes. So in particular, we can handle 3/4 of primes. I believe the residual classes here are 6 of the 8 possible classes. So we were able to make that work, which is, I think, somewhat nice. That there's this small miracle that happens with the number being amenable to these methods, and if anyone's interested in this computational algebraic number theory kind of element, I spent a lot of time trying to extend this to any other number field, and it seems to not for reasons out of the way. So answers that we So we implemented it, as I said, as I promised, with examples. So here are the examples. So if you want to look at the codes there. And we've got the Clifford T generators. And so we thought it'd be fun to write the Clifford T generators, which are the standard ones. Everyone sort of uses them in quantum computing classes and such. Write those out in terms of our new proposed icosahedral generators. And we're going to use what I think is very high precision, right? 10 to the 10 is a huge number. 1 over 10 to the 10 is minuscule. And so for T, we just kind of write it out. So our heuristic predicts that we should get something like 16.9. We come up with 19, which is, of course, more. And the reason we can account for this is it's not really just 7/3 times log 1 over epsilon cubed. It's 7/3 plus low of 1. And so there's no promises on when the low of 1 starts decaying, when it really decays. So we can see that there's some amount of decay because 19 versus 17. 16.9 needs to be at least 17 But 17 to 19 isn't that horrible as far as I'm concerned. And get extremely high precision rates. We wanted 1 over 10 to 10, we come up with 1.3 over 10 to 10. So clearly something right is happening. If our little one isn't quite fully kicked in, but it's starting to kick in, and we're getting this high precision. And for this other one, for H, we come up with gamma 1, gamma 2. And we get our tau count of 45, we predict at 39, again, at least 40. But again, we come up with, it's coincidence that precisions, or the errors here are the same, after the 8 data. But what happens here is, again, the low of 1 is not fully kicked in, but clearly something's happening because we're really not that far off. We're off by a few gates here and there. Nothing systemic. It's not like we've got 100 tau count versus 40 as a prediction. So I feel very comfortable saying that there's kind of proof in the pudding that something right is happening with these heuristics about when this algorithm should start to turn. So ask some further questions. Ask some follow-up questions, which are, well, we got this beta in beta log 1 over epsilon cubed to be 7/3. One question is, how close can we get to beta equals 1? It's empty complete when beta is 1, so we know what we're making compared to that, if you believe P is not empty. But can we get 1.1? Can we get 1.01? Can we get 2? No one currently has any, at least as far as I'm aware, on how you can get anything below 7/3. So this is very interesting. This is this idea of shaving down this prefactor. Previous to this work and some other related lines of work, the prefactor was at 3, using this sort of new idea of Corral to petit adapted to the continuous setting. We cut the 3 down to 7/3. Can we get lower? And as far as I know, this is relatively wide. So this idea of C-naughts didn't come up. If you're familiar with quantum computing for obviously C-naughts, it turns out that C-naughts and a universal single gate set are universal for n qubits, as long as your C-naughts can pair up any pair of wires. But maybe this isn't the way to go. Well, what would you want to do for 2 wires, for 2 qubits at once, for n qubits at once? So Everett and Krasnodębski have published some work on P3. 3, of course, is the power of 2, so this isn't exactly a quantum result, but it's in the right direction, right? We're stepping up 2 to 3. Maybe we can get PU4 eventually. Maybe once we understand what's happening in PU4, we'll understand PU to the end. That's sort of the dream. So this is sort of another avenue that this field is pursuing. And so I just want to thank co-author Terrence, Pearson, who introduced us, and we're going to do a special session for having our paper and allowing us to do that. Here are some of the papers that came up. Our actual archive preprint has a lot more citations. If this doesn't quite have our field. That's it. Questions?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for our speaker? I have a question. How far along are they coming with the actual physical quantum computers?
Depends who you ask. So if you ask like Google and IBM, they're very far along. But I think there's a lot of healthy skepticism. In particular, you might hear about the big result from 2019 with the Google quantum computer that had 53 qubits and was the quantum advantage result, where they essentially did something that a quantum computer did something that I believe classical computers can't do. This is, I think, some of the caveats to that, and I'm no expert in the actual engineering of it, but my understanding is that some of the caveats are that the benchmarking that they did for the classical computer against a quantum computer may not have been optimized in ways that could. I think the other real hurdle, aside from sort of how we even measure this, because it's 2 fundamentally different modes of computation, the other hurdle is that On the engineering side, so much noise creeps in from environments that we need some real robust notion of pond air pressure. And I think this is relatively, I think just having enough qubits that function and don't just immediately falsetto noise. Just having enough that work long enough for an algorithm to actually run is another challenge. Because we have some pond air pressure protocols. I think one thing that people research is how to have more efficient pond air correction, so fewer additional qubits needed to actually make your main working register run. I think these are two, but certainly nothing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Wait,
Oh, here's another question.
Just one quick question. Have you thought, or has anybody thought much about how this goes for higher end, like PUN, these approximation algorithms?
Yeah, so
Because it's, I mean, to me, this is the obvious untapped field. They're qubits, they're great, but there's a lot of efficiency for something.
right, so
With
this
higher
is
medical state.
this is the PU3, right, where it's even kind of not fully understood, or I wouldn't say even PU2 is fully understood, but PU3 is understood even less.
So it gets harder.
Yes.
So nobody's really generalized to say what's going to happen. That's what
But it's moving forward. I think it's not yielding quite so nicely. And one kind of interesting thing about the history of even the PU2 case is that this golden gate idea really dates back to the 80s in just completely different contexts, where it's the LPS papers, Lasky Phillips happened to do this stuff that, as I understand, was no one thought had any connection on computers, and then it wasn't until about a decade ago that people realized, oh, this is approximation in unitary groups. This is what you need for a quantum computer, and then this reignited some interest in these applications. So maybe there's some dormant idea that is needed for the PU3 case or the hybrid PU case, or maybe it's something that is done today that will then be relevant in another 30, 40 years.
are there any other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much. It was great.